Welcome to the Haskell Hall in the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer in Ruston, Louisiana, in the United States. This is a seven session series on the letter to the Colossians, which is one of the letters in the Pauline corpus of the New Testament. Today's session is called Paul After Paul. And so instead of actually an introduction to the letter to the Colossians itself, I want to give you a little bit of context for what I'm going to say in the following 6 sessions about Colossians. Some of you may have heard some of this before, more generally about the New Testament, but I don't think it'll be a bad thing to review that if it is a review for you. It would be helpful if you have a copy of the New Testament that you can refer to. Okay, speaking of the New Testament is a collection of collections. And by that, I mean it is a collection of separate collections of writings by early believers in Jesus. And the New Testament was mostly written in the 1st century, and some of the New Testament may well have been written in the early 2nd century. And it was probably in the early to mid 2nd century that a lot of the collecting took place, and a lot more needs to be said about that, but I cannot do that today. But among the collections of early Christian literature, the earliest collection of early Christian literature is the New Testament. And the next collection of early Christian literature after the New Testament is a group of writings called the Apostolic Fathers. And then after that, there's a group of writings that are written by people who are defending the Christian faith and defending Christians against persecution, and they are called the apologists. You've heard of Justin Martyr, who wrote the first apology in Rome. And in the first apology of Justin Martyr, he describes a Sunday Eucharist. Boy, is that important for the study of early Christian worship. But before you get to the apologists in the 2nd century and the Apostolic Fathers in the late 1st century, and especially 2nd century, it would be good to try to understand the earliest collection of early Christian writings. These collections include the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There were also other Gospels that were written later, but were not part of the canon of the New Testament. Then there is a book that is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, and this book is called the Acts of the Apostles. And then there are 7 letters that are called the Catholic epistles or the general letters, and they include James and Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So there are 7 Catholic epistles or general letters. And then the Revelation of John, or the Revelation to John, is the final book in the canon of the New Testament. But the earliest collection of early Christian literature to be collected and to be written was, in fact, the Pauline corpus. Now, the Pauline corpus is the term that we use today, and it's been used for a long time. My German colleagues refer to it as das Corpus Paulinum. It's perfectly good to say it in Latin, Corpus Paulinum. But most of us in English refer to it as the Pauline corpus. And the Pauline corpus includes the 14 documents that are or have been attributed to Paul and were collected together and transmitted together in the manuscript tradition as the New Testament was transmitted. You transmit the New Testament by copying it into manuscripts, and many of the manuscripts of the Pauline corpus have all 14 documents in them. By using the term Pauline corpus or Corpus Paulinum, we are not saying they were all written by Paul. because we know that they were not. Okay? The Pauline corpus includes 7 letters of undisputed authorship by Paul. And then it includes 3 letters about which there is a great deal of debate as to whether Paul wrote them or not. I'm one of those debaters. And then there are 3 letters that very few scholars, a minority of scholars thinks that Paul wrote them. And then there is a document that is not even a letter that cannot possibly be by Paul, and it's called the Letter to the Hebrews. But actually, form critically, it is not a letter. And it also is in a different Greek style, and it also has a different theology than Paul. And it also is anonymous. It does not claim to have been written by anybody. But it was collected in the manuscript tradition with the Pauline letters. And so it's part of the Corpus Paulinum, or the Pauline corpus. But nobody, the last respectable New Testament scholars who thought that Paul wrote Hebrews were Roman Catholic scholars before Vatican II. And since Vatican II, nobody respectable thinks that Paul wrote Hebrews. The letters of undisputed authorship in the Pauline corpus are these 7. Romans, and this is in the order that you find them in the New Testament. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians. Paul's earliest letter is 1 Thessalonians, and then his shortest letter is Philemon, which is only 25 verses. And these letters are put into the New Testament. The whole Pauline corpus, with the exception of Hebrews, is in the approximate order of how long they are, because Romans has 16 chapters, 1 Corinthians has 16 chapters, 2 Corinthians has 13 chapters, Galatians has 6, Philippians has 4, 1 Thessalonians has 5, and Philemon has 1 lone chapter. And so these letters, we do not dispute their authorship, and for very good reason. Now, Robert Jewett and I wrote a book called The Corinthian Correspondence, and we argue that 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is an edited collection of originally 8 Corinthian letters. And most scholars divide up 2 Corinthians, and a few of us, very few of us, divide up 1 Corinthians. But with the exception of 1 Corinthians 14, 33b through 36, we think that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. With the exception of Romans 16, 17 through 20, we think that Paul wrote all of Romans. Then there are 3 letters about which there is much debate about authorship. I wrote a dissertation directed by Robert Jewett on 2 Thessalonians, arguing that Paul did not write 2 Thessalonians. And Bob Jewett published a book that said Paul did write 2 Thessalonians. And he also got my book published. So we agreed to disagree long ago in the 80s about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, about 2nd Thessalonians. He also believed that Paul may have kind of sort of dictated Colossians, but that another person wrote down Colossians, which is the position of Eduard Schweitzer, who taught at the University of Zurich. I don't agree with that position. And most New Testament scholars don't think that Ephesians was written by Paul. And we all think, just about all of us think, that the writer of Ephesians had a copy of Colossians, and that Colossians and Ephesians have a relationship with each other, kind of like Mark and Matthew or Mark and Luke. In other words, we believe that Ephesians used Colossians as a written source. A few people believe it the other way around. But we all believe that there's a literary relationship between Colossians and Ephesians. So these 3 letters are called the Deutero-Pauline letters because they are in a second level of being by Paul. And then there are 3 letters that have been called pastoral letters since the early 19th century. But they also may have been called something like a pastoral rule as far back as St. Thomas Aquinas. But these 3 letters that are referred to as the pastoral epistles are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And so the large majority of New Testament scholars believes that these are not written by the Apostle Paul. A few people believe that Paul didn't write 1 Timothy and Titus, but that Paul did write 2 Timothy. And that if 2 Timothy was written by Paul, Paul's in jail and he's about to die and he knows it. And, I'm about to die and this is my last will and testament kind of thing. I'm not convinced that Paul wrote 2 Timothy, but a few people are. For example, the late Jerome Murphy O'Connor of the École Biblique in Jerusalem believed that. But the large majority, I would say 80-90% of New Testament scholars don't believe that Paul wrote the pastoral epistles. And then the Pauline corpus ends. It's like it's not in among the rest of them in terms of its order. It's like it's there kind of as an afterthought, perhaps. Hebrews is there. It has 13 chapters. And no current New Testament scholar of any respectability holds that Paul wrote it. And of course, why would you hold that Paul writes it? Unless you read the King James Version that says the epistle of St. Paul to the Hebrews. But the manuscripts don't say that, and Hebrews itself does not claim to have been written by Paul. And so it's in the Pauline corpus. It's at the end of the Pauline corpus. Even though it has 13 chapters, it's after Philemon that has 1 chapter. And the rest of them are in the approximate order of their length. So Hebrews is sort of there as an afterthought, perhaps. How about that? So the last respectable people that believe Hebrews was by Paul were Roman Catholics before Vatican II. Humongously positive things have been said about Paul and his importance to the earliest church. Paul was the earliest Christian writer. No one wrote anything that we have any manuscripts of before 1 Thessalonians. And Paul is considered the greatest missionary of all time. In his famous book, The Theology of Paul the Apostle, which I've taught through at least 3 times, Paul has been referred to as the first and greatest Christian theologian. And in the great Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, the great dictionary of church history, it's the book that you buy on about the second day of seminary, right? The ODCC. And in the entry on Paul by, I'm assuming, F.L. Cross himself at Oxford, Paul was referred to as, quote, the most powerful human personality in the history of the church. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or otherwise. A powerful personality, a powerfully good personality, powerfully bad personality. Unfortunately, we can't ask Professor Cross because he's dead. But anyway, those Oxford people, oh my. Well, we know a lot about Paul. We know a lot about St. Paul because instead of having little amounts of information about Paul, we have big amounts of information about Paul. And the problem is there's so much information about Paul in the Pauline corpus and in Acts. You have to sort through it. And when some of this information conflicts with other information, you have to decide what is the most likely to be the case. There are some people who don't believe there is pseudonymity, or they don't believe that there is conflict between Paul and Acts, but they are far from the mainstream. But anyway, you notice that I list Paul's authentic letters first, and then I could list the Deutero-Pauline and pastoral letters second, and then Acts third. But basically, in terms of what is really reliable and fully believable, I have to give Paul's authentic letters first place always. Outside the New Testament, there is information about Hellenistic and Roman culture that in general does add to our knowledge of Paul and the kinds of things that Paul would have done. And then we have learned a lot about Judaism from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we've learned a lot about Judaism now that the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of which were found in 1947, we now have really digested them, and many of us have taught the Dead Sea Scrolls and learned the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we refer to them. We now have a pretty good study edition. Brill has published it, and it was co-published by William B. Erdmans in this country. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls add to our knowledge of Paul. However, in both of these cases, the Greco-Roman stuff and the Jewish stuff, and some of the Jewish stuff is also Greco-Roman, to be honest. In both of these cases, the meaning and value of these sources outside the New Testament for our knowledge of Paul are intensely debated by New Testament scholars. We go to meetings and debate these things. We have a meeting every November, and it is usually the weekend before Thanksgiving. Saturday through Tuesday before Thanksgiving, we have the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting. There's also at the same time the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, so we refer to them as the annual meetings. And so we go to these meetings, and we give papers, we listen to other people giving papers, and we respond to those papers publicly. We now respond a lot privately by email, but this is part of how we discuss these things. Since we're not in the same city, we're not in the same country, it's very easy for us to discuss them in social media, and certainly we send a lot of papers to each other as attachments to emails. People review our books. We write books. People review our books, etc. And we do this using electronic media, and so that has really sped up our communication with each other. The good part about teaching through these things is that when you teach through something, it forces you to read not only the primary literature in the New Testament, but it forces you to read, as you can, the secondary literature about the New Testament. So it's important for scholars to keep interacting with each other and with students. So I think that's a good thing, and I guess that's why I do it. Well, you have to ask questions when you study anything. And the biggest question of all is, how do you know anything about people in the ancient world? Well, you don't know anything about anybody from the ancient world unless you can read about it from an ancient source. And so when you have ancient sources about people and events in the ancient world, if you are using a historical method, which is to say what really happened then, you have to distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources. A primary source is written directly by somebody who had something to do with the event that's being studied. In other words, the primary source for Paul is the letters of Paul. They are primary sources. The secondary source is something written by someone other than the person we are studying, or somebody who says they saw something or something happened, but they were not actually an eyewitness to it. That is called a secondary source. And so since John Knox's famous book called Chapters in a Life of Paul, published in 1950, Chapters in a Life of Paul, which is still in print, I believe, with Mercer University Press, Chapters in a Life of Paul was the first book that made the distinction between a primary source and secondary sources in the study of Paul. And he showed that the primary source was the authentic letters of Paul only. And the secondary source, of great value too, but a secondary source nonetheless, is the Acts of the Apostles. And so no one really said that in print before John Knox. And that book affected everybody who has done Pauline chronologies ever since that time. My teacher read it when he was in Tübingen doing a doctorate at the University of Tübingen. And then a younger fellow named Gerd Ludemann read it when he was doing his doctorate in Göttingen. And so Gerd Ludemann was a German, my teacher was an American, but both of them, quite independently of each other, read John Knox's work and then analyzed the book of Acts and analyzed the authentic Pauline letters, and they came to the conclusion that John Knox was right in distinguishing the authentic letters of Paul as the only primary sources, and the Acts of the Apostles as a secondary source, and anything else as a secondary source as well. So that was a major, major, major breakthrough in the study of the letters of Paul, namely to decide what you do with the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, believe it or not, most of Paul's time was spent not writing or dictating letters. Very important people didn't write letters by hand, they dictated them. And they basically, the people who wrote them down wrote them on papyri, and you bought rolls of papyri and you used what you needed, and if you didn't need any more, you cut it there. So, but most of the time that Paul was doing his thing, Paul was not writing or dictating letters, but rather he was planting churches and also dealing with the problems of the churches that he had planted and trying to figure out the best way to plant a church. Romans 15, when you read Romans 15, he's talking about how he's going to do a mission to Spain. And Jewett showed in his commentary on Romans, which he spent a quarter century writing, he showed that the major thing that's going on behind the scenes in Romans is that Paul is trying to unify Gentile and Jewish house churches in Rome so that they can support in one way or another his mission to Spain. And so Paul is very much trying to figure out the best way to do a mission wherever it is he's wanting to go. When you figure out when Paul wrote letters, first of all, you have to get Paul to that town, have him found the church there, and then go somewhere else. And then for some reason, Paul writes a letter back to that town, back to that church. So you've got to get Paul founding the church first in that place. Then he goes somewhere else to found the church or do something at a church elsewhere. And then he finds out that there is a need to correct things in the first church, and then he writes a letter to that first church. So that's part of the problem with dating Pauline letters, is you can't date Pauline letters unless you can figure out where Paul was when. And that's the challenge of doing it. By the way, Paul calls himself an apostolos. And an apostolos is one who is sent, or one who is sent out. Stello is to send, and apostello means to send out. And so this is a technical term in Paul, and the way Paul uses the term is as an envoy, or perhaps the best way to translate it today is a traveling church planter. That's what an apostolos was. That's the difference, by the way, in the New Testament between an apostolos and an episkopos, or bishop. A bishop is stationary in one town or one city, whereas apostoloi go around planting churches, and they had all this problem between who is in charge, right? Because they go everywhere, right? There are two definitions of apostoloi in the New Testament. The earlier definition is Paul's, and we say it's earlier because Paul's writings are earlier, right? And anyone who has been sent or who has seen the risen Christ. If you see the risen Christ and the risen Christ tells you, this is what I want you to do, to bring the faith to somebody somewhere else, that is your apostolic calling, right? And then the later definition of apostolos is the one that's in the Gospels and also in the book of Acts. one of the 12 disciples, one of the original 12 followers of Jesus, whom Jesus, he goes by the seashore and sees Peter and Andrew and James and John. Those are the first 4 apostles. And so the definition of an apostolos being one of the original 12 is apparently a later definition than Paul's definition, because Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels. The Gospels, I would not date Mark before 70 CE, whereas Paul's letters can easily be dated to 50 or even before 50 CE. And then Paul's death has been calculated by Jewett in his book on chronology. He calculated it as the year 62. It has to be while Nero was emperor. Well, what do you know about Paul? Well, one thing you can certainly bank on is that Paul died. And the very credible tradition about the death of Paul is that he died when Nero was emperor of Rome. Nero, we know, was emperor between 54 and 68 CE, the Common Era. By early church tradition, Paul was put to death by beheading. Why? Because he claimed to be a Roman citizen as a person born in Tarsus. And so since he was a Roman citizen, he could not be crucified. It was against the law to crucify Roman citizens. Crucifixion is for criminals who were not citizens of Rome. Quoting the late Robert Grant in his book, Augustus to Constantine, quote, "The significance of Paul for early Christianity was second only to that of Jesus." And many other writers who have studied the New Testament, and especially Paul, would tell you the same thing. The 2 major thinkers in the New Testament are Jesus and Paul. Everybody else is secondary to them. And Paul has traditionally been considered, and I consider him to be, the father of Christian theology. Not that he is the only theologian who wrote the New Testament, but he did it first because his letters are first. From several texts from the early church, we learn about the martyrdom of Paul. Eusebius was the 4th century church historian, and Eusebius drew on several church historians who were before him. Eusebius participated in the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. And in Book 2 of his ecclesiastical history, Book 2, chapter 25, he quoted Proclus, an earlier person, and Eusebius wrote, "But I can point out the trophies of the apostles." And the word that is translated trophies means like graves or bodies. But it could also mean like something built over the grave. But I can point out the trophies of the apostles, for if you will go to the Vatican Hill in Rome, or to the Ostian Way, the road to Ostia, you will find the trophies of those who founded this church. And then a little bit earlier in Book 2, chapter 25, Eusebius wrote, "It is related," note that in the passive, "it is related that in his time Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified, and the title of Peter and Paul, which is still given to the cemeteries there, confirms the stories." And so originally they were buried in the local Roman cemeteries. Peter was, and Paul was buried on the Ostian Way, and his body was dumped there. There is a tradition of Roman basilicas. Some of us know that there are 4 basilicas in the city of Rome, and the 2 most celebrated basilicas in Rome are St. Peter's Basilica, which is over the traditional tomb of the Apostle Peter, and the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, which is built over the historic tomb of the Apostle Paul, whose body was dumped on the Ostian Road, and then he was buried there, and then later a monument was built over that, and then later a basilica was built over that. And so that is the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Anglicans may be interested to know that before the Reformation, when the Archbishop of Canterbury became a cardinal, the cardinalatial titular church that was given to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a cardinal, was the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. That's another ecumenical officer told me that in the 90s, and I want to check that out. But St. Paul outside the walls is very old. The basilica that is there now is not the original one built by Constantine, but it's very, very historic. To argue that Paul did not write Colossians does not affect its status as inspired Holy Scripture, and it does not affect its status, its place in the Pauline corpus of the New Testament. But when you raise the question about whether Paul wrote Colossians, you are raising an important set of questions about when and where and how Colossians fits into the tradition of Pauline churches during his lifetime and or after his death. And so the Pauline corpus of letters is not a complete catalog of everything that happened during the lifetime of Paul or after the death of Paul. It is an unfortunately fragmentary set of remains of the Pauline tradition of Christianity in the late 1st century and in the early 2nd century. And so we don't know everything we would like to know about the death of Paul. We don't know everything we'd like to know about the Pauline corpus. But we have to use historical methods rigorously and consistently. Otherwise, if you don't use historical methods consistently and rigorously, you have no right to say what happened during the lifetime of Paul or after the death of Paul. And therefore, it's appropriate for us to interpret the texts that we have as what they actually are. And you don't know what they actually are until you look at the evidence. And there is a difference, perhaps, between what they actually are based on our evidence, between that and what we would perhaps like them to be based on what Mama told us when we were 10 years old, or what the pastor told us when we were 11 or 12, okay? We as adults have to use adult methods and think in an adult way when we study the Pauline corpus or when we study the New Testament. If it is likely, as I believe it is, that Colossians is a Deuteropauline letter rather than a letter written by Paul himself, it therefore would make sense to interpret Colossians not by comparison to events during the lifetime of Paul, but in relation to events in Christian churches after Paul's death. In other words, after Paul's death, since Paul was so important in the early church, these things that are after Paul's death are responding actually to Paul's martyrdom. Colossians also is very interesting for a number of reasons, because Paul did not found a church in Colossae. Colossians is written portraying Paul as the writer and as being incarcerated. Now, I think you have the right to ask, exactly why would Paul have written to Christians in Colossae, since Paul did not found a church in Colossae? And even more interesting is the fact that Colossae was destroyed by an earthquake during the years 60 or 61 CE. And Paul died in about 62 CE, if it is correct that Paul died under Nero. So there are all sorts of interesting questions that we would like to answer, and we have to use rigorous historical methods and follow the methods consistently. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you don't have the right to say anything about Paul. My approach to Colossians is to follow the majority of scholars who argue against Pauline authorship of Colossians. And therefore, I am going to present Colossians in this class as a letter which reflects the martyrdom of Paul and tries to teach its readers the meaning of the martyrdom of Paul for churches in the late 1st century CE. In my dissertation, directed by Robert Jewett, and it was a Northwestern University dissertation in '84, and it was published January of '89 by Sheffield as Early Christian Rhetoric in 2 Thessalonians. I argued for a relationship among the 3 Deuteropauline letters, Colossians and Ephesians on one hand, and 2 Thessalonians on the other. And I'll present a little bit more about that next week. By the way, Ephesians most likely use Colossians as a literary source. A few people see it the other way around, such as Ernst Percy sees it the other way around, but the large majority of people believe that the writer of Ephesians used Colossians as a literary source. One of the things that you see in Colossians and Ephesians is that Colossians especially has just about completely dropped Paul's eschatology, his doctrine of the last things. And Ephesians puts a little bit, if Ephesians used Colossians as a source, Ephesians puts a little bit of Paul's eschatology back in, but Colossians does not. If you were to look at these passages that I have on the slide, particularly 1 Thessalonians 1, 9, and 10, it speaks of Jesus who saves us from the wrath that is coming. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 5, 3, it describes what is going to happen at the second coming of Christ, right? Romans 8, towards the end of Romans 8, you have the last judgment scene, which is portrayed as a courtroom scene. So Paul, in his earliest letter, 1 Thessalonians, and in his latest letter, Romans, believes there is going to be a last judgment and that Christians will be justified by Christ. So Paul never, ever drops the idea that there will be a second coming and a last judgment. You can find a lot about the second coming of Christ and the necessity of Christ being raised from the dead and eventually Christians being raised from the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. And I encourage all of the people who see this video to look up those chapters and verses in the authentic letters of Paul. And so the problem is, since Paul has a very robust eschatology, Paul believes big time in the last things and in what's going to happen at the last things, including the resurrection of Christ and including, well, the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of Christians. It's inconceivable that Paul would drop that understanding of the second coming of Christ. And yet, in fact, in Colossians, I have argued that that eschatological stuff, the emphasis on the last things, has been so modified that it's pretty much the same as having been dropped in Colossians. There's a little bit of eschatology, I would say, in Ephesians, but not a heck of a lot. So that's a big difference. There's a big difference between the eschatology, Paul's doctrine of the last things that you see in the authentic letters of Paul, versus the eschatology, or the lack of eschatology, in Colossians. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. And the importance of Paul is very high. Paul was the founder of Christian theology, and he was also the traveling missionary church planter par excellence. That's what an apostle is, a traveling missionary church planter. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul is portrayed as the apostle who was the most active and effective church planter, pretty much from chapter 13 on to the end of the book. And basically, Paul's calling as an apostle, his encounter with the risen Christ, is in Acts chapter 9. And so Paul did that and is the most famous apostle to have done that. He was a great planter of Gentile churches. During Paul's ministry as an apostle, which concluded with his death in 62, as far as there is evidence, we believe that no apostle did more to plant churches than St. Paul. If anyone did do more to plant churches than St. Paul, it would be nice to see some evidence, but there isn't any. And therefore, it is quite unsurprising that there was a major reaction within Gentile churches, who were by far the majority of churches, after Paul's martyrdom. Some would be tempted to give up the Christian faith and life because Paul, their founding apostle, and really practically almost the founding apostle of Gentile Christianity, Paul had been put to death. So, okay, what happens now that Paul's no longer here to be the glue that holds these churches together? You can also see in Colossians reflection on the meaning of Paul's death, which was a martyrdom, which I find that in Colossians 2:5, for though I am absent in body, and of course if Paul is dead, he's really absent in body, right? Yet I am with you in spirit, and I rejoice to see your morale and the firmness of your faith in Christ. And then what about people who are worried that Paul was a criminal? Paul was a jailbird, and then he was put to death because he was a criminal. Well, Colossians 1:24 has Paul rejoicing in his sufferings. I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church. Note the church being the body of Christ, which we see in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. But in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. Paul never says anything like that in the authentic letters. But in Colossians 1, the end of 1 and the beginning of 2, it says, it is he, Christ, whom we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone in all wisdom, so that we may present, we, by the way, is Paul, we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil and struggle with all the energy that he powerfully inspires within me. And then chapter 2, verse 1, for I want you to know how much I am struggling for you and for those in Laodicea and for all who have not seen me face to face. So even if you're a member of a Gentile church and you never saw Paul, you never heard Paul, the Paul who struggled in his sufferings before his death, he was struggling for the sake of the Gentile churches before his death. And so by the time of his death, in around 62 CE, if Jewett is correct, it was very well known that Paul wrote letters to churches that he had founded, plus Romans. Romans was written to a group of house churches who were congregations he did not found. Paul's letters were thought to be persuasive. Paul's enemies said this, they say, Paul is saying, they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his appearance is weak and his public speaking is terrible. And that's exactly opposite what you would expect to say about anyone who did rhetoric. It's very much against the tradition of rhetoric for speeches delivered in person to be thought to be weak and for letters to be thought to be strong, meaning persuasive. So that is quite a striking difference between Paul and the tradition of rhetoric. And so for Paul's letters to be rated as more persuasive than his speeches delivered in person was an incredibly positive evaluation of the persuasive power of his letters, which even his enemies acknowledged in 2 Corinthians 10:10. And therefore, after his martyrdom, it was only natural for Paul to continue to teach through his letters. How does Paul teach through his letters? His letters are copied, and the copies are disseminated in the early church. This teaching effort included the publication of Paul's letters, including a very edited form of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. If you follow our book, The Corinthian Correspondence, Redaction, Rhetoric, and History, which was published in October of 2021, we have argued that the original 8 letters were edited down to 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And so, how does Paul now teach? The dead Paul, the martyred Paul, Saint Paul, now teaches through a collection of Pauline letters, and this collection would become the Pauline corpus that we know. And the Pauline corpus that we know includes a variety of things. It includes integral, authentic letters of Paul, Galatians, Romans, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. It included highly edited forms of authentic Pauline letters, including 2 Corinthians, highly edited and badly edited, and 1 Corinthians, pretty well edited, and probably Philippians. It included the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters, Colossians, along with Ephesians and along with 2 Thessalonians. It included the pastoral letters, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and it included something that has nothing at all to do with Paul and is not a letter, and we don't know who it was written to, but form critically, it is not a letter, with the exception of chapter 13, which sounds like the end of a letter. But the bulk of Hebrews is form critically not a letter. And so it has nothing to do with Paul. But nonetheless, as the Pauline corpus eventually was put together and circulated, and we know about the circulation because of the manuscript tradition, Hebrews was increasingly included in that collection of letters. There are letters to churches where the church is in pretty good shape, like 1 Thessalonians and like Romans. There are letters reflecting conflict. Galatians was written to a group of churches that were in conflict, and 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 was to a Corinthian church which was in deep, deep, deep conflict. And Paul had to write a really extremely severe letter. And 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is that letter. And then there are letters in which Paul's example as a Christian missionary leader comes to the fore in order to deal with problems, and Colossians is like that. And so Colossians is a response to the death of Paul. That is what most of us believe, although not all of us. And so I will endeavor to show you in this series how Colossians fits into the expected reaction of Gentile churches after the death of Paul. Thank you very much. And then here is the schedule for the rest of the class.